So you can all hear me, right? All right, nice. Yeah, the tabernacle's here. Isn't that something? Yeah. I was gonna, when we opened it up, the three of us were there and in the sacristy, and right away, Father Romke's like, let's do it. Let's put it out on Thursday, because that's he's got Holy Thursday Mass. I'm like, no way. And I said, how about Saturday? Because I got the Holy Saturday Mass, and then he got all like pouty. So, but then I thought, you know what? Well, let's just do it tonight. And so we already had Mass at 5:30 with that, and it's awesome. So what a great! So we want to thank all the good, generous folks who donated the tabernacle to us, especially the Lindberghs, and for the memory that all the deceased members of the Wagner and Lindbergh families. Huh? So nice. And what I'm going to do afterwards, and hopefully it won't take too long, but at 8 o'clock, I'm going to open the tabernacle, and you guys can all come up. Because have you ever seen the inside of the tabernacle, like been close to see the inside? You have? Of course you have. Oh, well, yeah, you would as a sacristan. Yeah. So, but the inside is amazing. There's all this carving, and there's some etching of Adorote Devote Latens Deitas, which is the first line of Thomas Aquinas' song on the Blessed Sacrament. We adore you devotedly, hidden God. There's some angels in there, and it's magnificent. And all the way around are the 12 apostles, and their names are etched at the base of each carving. So please, afterwards, all I'd ask when you come up and I open the doors is that you come up and you just genuflect, because the Blessed Sacrament's in there. And we're going to consecrate it or bless it Thursday night, about 5 minutes before the Mass of the Lord's Supper. We're going to bless it, and then we'll have Mass. So that way everybody wins. Father Romke gets it, Father DeTomo gets it, I get it, you get it. And then also, this has nothing to do with the talk tonight, but in the old church, the gym, Father Gordon had a very elaborate altar in there. Anybody remember it? The altar in there? And there were candlesticks along the back wall and on the altar, some gold candlesticks, which have been in storage for years. I don't know how long. And we decided, well, wouldn't it be nice if the candlesticks went with the tabernacle? So we got them, they're getting cleaned up, and we're going to have them on the altar for Holy Thursday, and we'll just leave them there, and we'll move these into the chapel, and we'll have these gold candlesticks that match the baptismal candle, that's just temporary, and we're having the baptismal candle cleaned up as well. And the base of the candle is the same as the base on these candles, and without me even knowing it, is the base of this cross that's on the altar. It's the same one. It goes with this. It's so incredible. So it's a set. It all matches. So hopefully you guys will like that when we see it. But what a great way to begin Holy Week and do all this. And it's nice to use something that's from our history, from the church that Father Gordon built. I don't know if the altar, those candlesticks were in the tent church, but I'm sure they could have been going all the way back to the 40s when all this great parish started. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the crucifixion of Jesus. We're going to talk about the Shroud of Turin. This is the back panel. This is the front panel, and the significance of this and why it's so extraordinary. And you hear a lot of things like on the History Channel when they come out every Easter or Holy Week with shows that debunk the Christian faith and try to demythologize or mythologize the Christian faith. But you look at this, and there's no human explanation. There's no natural process that could bring about the Shroud of Turin. So we'll talk about that tonight, because I think a lot of us don't know that. I didn't know it when I started studying it. I'm going to read this. Well, actually, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read an account of just what crucifixion, medically speaking, huh? Do you want to hear that? Yeah. Okay. All right, so when we start, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. So there's a lot of historians, Josephus among them, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, who wrote about how crucifixion came about, how terrible it was. It began as a practice by the Persians, 500 BC. The Carthaginians did it. The Greeks did it under Alexander the Great, but the Roman Empire, that was their one of their major modes of execution. And then remember that movie Spartacus with who was it? Kirk Douglas, who was Spartacus. That was historically correct in terms of the number of people that were crucified by the Romans. 6,000 were executed and put on crosses all up and down the Appian Way, all the way to Rome. So it was common practice. Also, scourging was also something that was practiced, but it was limited by law to 39 or 40 less 1, so as not to kill or severely injure the person. You're going to find out that the person who is on the shroud was scourged a lot more than 39 times. The walk to the crucifixion would have been done naked, and as for a Jew, that would have been even more important, because that was a horrible, shaming experience. They abhorred nudity in that sense. There was a crossbar that was through the wrist as they carried it. They would have been brought to a stake that would have been either the whole cross that they carried or a cross beam that would have been put in the ground, and then they would have lifted up after they had tied them or nailed them to the cross beam. They would have lifted it up and put them up there. And sometimes they did it somewhat low, so the dogs or animals could come and eat the victims at night after the thing was finished. So 2 soldiers on each side would lift the crossbar to engage it with the stipes, the crossbeam. Then the legs of the person were crossed in the feet position, one on top of the other, and then a long nail was driven through. So this person would have endured severe scourging, then made to walk with a heavy beam over his right shoulder, and there would have been pain, the loss of blood. He would have been in a state of shock. The soldiers nail him to the cross, impaling him onto the wood, creating a deeper state of shock. So the excruciating pain in the arms, legs, chest. There's profuse perspiration, thirst, dehydration, a decrease in blood volume. And so with the loss of blood and a decline in blood pressure, there's a decrease in blood flow, a loss of oxygen to tissue, so there's pooling of blood in the legs, and fluid accumulation in the pleural and pericardial cavities in the heart. This brings low cardiac output, difficult breathing, and so because the Sabbath was approaching, the soldiers would have broken the legs of those who were still alive, further deepening the state of shock and causing death to occur very rapidly. If the person were dead, a soldier would thrust a spear into the right side or the right chest to pierce the heart to make sure that he was dead. And that was the centurion who would have been there, the Roman executioner, who would have had to ensure that the death had been carried out. Okay, so that's kind of a little bit of background on what crucifixion is. And so what I want to talk about then is you have an image here of a person who's buried, who's undergone crucifixion, and we'll talk about it. It's pretty obvious, but we'll talk about that in a minute. What I want to talk about, since this talk is on the Shroud of Turin, I want to talk about just the basic element, which is this piece of cloth. What is it? Before we even talk about it as a burial shroud of Jesus, let's talk about it as a piece of Jewish cloth. Now, the Jews had a ritual purity rule. They didn't use linen, or they didn't use fabric that was made out of a mixture of cotton and wool. That was unclean material. And so, especially for their Passover, they would have had to have a ritually pure, new piece of linen that they would have put over the table. And the speculation, and again, it's speculation, but what's interesting is that the cloth, the Shroud of Turin, is cloth that passes that ritual purity. It's all cotton, it's linen. All right, so that's expensive, and it would be something that only that they would have procured as a necessity, like a Passover meal or a burial, because the burial laws also require that the person be placed in a similar mixture of linen with a little bit of cotton but no wool, and this cloth follows that. So does that's the cloth that would have been used. Now, this is the interesting thing, that the Last Supper would have been at a rather large table to seat all those people. Now, the dimensions of the shroud are, in English measure, 14 feet by 3 inches long. All right, this is obviously this is a small image. 14 feet by 3 inches long and 3 feet 7 inches wide. Okay? So the cloth for the Last Supper would have been about those dimensions to seat at a table. It would have also had to be made out of this material that the shroud was made out of. And so it would also correspond to the length of the garment used for a high priest in the temple. Now, the chasuble that I wear at Mass, that chasuble is designed off of the shape of the high priest's vestment that would have been used in the Jewish temple back in the 1st century in Jerusalem. That's why we wear what we wear. It's supposed to symbolize not the high priest in the temple, but the high priest, Jesus. Now, it's, again, speculation. The high priest's vestment had to be a seamless garment made out of the same precious, ritually pure material of linen. Could have little cotton, but no wool. It would have also been the same dimension as this shroud, and certainly the dimension that would have been used at the Last Supper. Think about it this way. Jesus, who was offering the Eucharist for the first time on this new piece of cloth, could have used it with a view to, because of the symbolism that connects the Eucharist to the high priesthood, who offers himself in sacrifice. The priest offers himself. He is not only he's the priest, but he's also the victim. And so here's the offering, the sacrifice, on this table. And it's also to symbolize the priest who offers it of himself. So that so the dimensions of the cloth on the table, similar to the dimensions of the high priest's vestment, both being by necessity made out of that same material. Then you say, well, how do you get the shroud out of that? Where are you going with this? Well, think about this, okay? Joseph of Arimathea knew that he had to obtain Pilate's permission to take Jesus' body down from the cross. Then he had to give Mary time alone with Jesus. Then he had to take the body to the rock-hewn tomb, his. Then he had to get a linen shroud within which to bury it. A shroud that would have met all the purity requirements that are the same as those needed for a high priest's vestment or a meal of the Last Supper or of the Passover. Then they would have had to say the prayers. They would have had to entomb him, and they had to do it all before sundown. So this is after Jesus dies at 3. He's taken, all those things have to take place with a very compressed period of time. When nobody knew that that was going to be necessary. Nobody knew that that burial shroud was going to be necessary. Nobody would have said, Jesus has been sick for several days and he's dying. We better get a shroud within which to bury him. This was all very quick, traumatic, violent, and then all of a sudden it happens. And they've got all these things they have to do in a very short period of time. And it's approaching sundown when everybody's going to do their Passover. Where are they going to get the material necessary to bury him? Because they haven't prepared for this, but they have to have it. And so this is one of my favorite things about the shroud, is that the idea that they would have had this cloth that they would have just celebrated the Passover on, and it's right there, and it's the right size, and it's the right material, and it's in their possession. So the idea that the shroud that Jesus is buried in is the cloth upon which he celebrated the Last Supper. Isn't that beautiful? Just think about that. All right. And also, another piece of symmetry between the shroud and the Passover. The Passover is a remembrance not of God's deliverance, but the means by which he did it. And that would have been the 10 plagues. All right? So the Passover is a remembrance of the 10 plagues by which God freed them. The plagues were blood first, then crocodiles, lice, wild animals, pestilence, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and then the killing of the firstborn son. Now in Jewish theology, Semitic theology, the first thing and the last thing are the most important things, and the things in the middle are less important. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. The beginning is blood, and the end is the killing of the firstborn son. And so you've got this beautiful symmetry of the Passover, the cloth upon which it's celebrated, and then the blood spilled of the firstborn son in that same cloth, which enwraps that mystery. Okay? And to back it up, Matthew says Jesus' body was wrapped in clean linen. Mark says that Joseph brought a linen shroud. Luke says Joseph wrapped Jesus in a linen shroud. John says they bound him in linen cloths. Why the difference? Because it wasn't just the shroud, it was the burial bands. Remember when Lazarus came out of the tomb? What did Jesus say? Untie him. And they would have tied they could have had a cloth around his face, a cloth over his head to keep his mouth shut, and they would have tied his hands and his feet. And then when they have this from John, which is the gospel for this Sunday, when Peter entered the empty tomb, he saw the linen cloths lying and the napkin which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. All right? So, and then remember, Peter and John saw that. And Peter looked in, he saw it, and he believed. You see cloth there. Why do you believe that Jesus resurrected from the dead? Because you see cloth there. Because Jesus said he was going to do it. And then you have this cloth there. Burial or grave robbers wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have taken the time to take the shroud off. They wouldn't have and place things neatly. All right? And we know that it was done in a certain specific way, because if it hadn't been, it would have destroyed the blood evidence that's on the shroud. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. And how it is that when they saw that cloth, and the way it was there, and you put that with what Jesus said about himself was going to happen, you can understand why Peter looked in and believed. All right? But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. And there's also the cloth that would have been on his face. The idea that they would have covered him with a face cloth after they took him down from the cross, and they brought him to the tomb, because there is a face cloth called the Sudarian. It's in Oviedo in Spain. It's a relic, and people go and see it in this church. And it has blood on it, type AB, negative blood. And its blood stains correspond directly to these blood stains here. See, wherever you see this bright white light, that's blood. Those are blood stains. The other image, we're going to talk about that in a minute, is not blood. Everybody's saying, oh, it's all blood? No, it's not. That's what makes this thing so miraculous. But where you see the bright white light, that's the blood. And the images of this blood are the images on the face cloth in Oviedo in Spain. And the same blood type, AB negative. You can say, well, that's no big deal. AB negative, well, there might be a lot of that going around. It isn't. The bloodstains on the Shroud and the Sudarian, type AB, the same AB blood that we find. Do you remember the miracle of Lanciano? Remember the priest was having difficulty with his faith, and he was saying Mass, and the host turned into blood and flesh, and they saved it. And every year, on 3 different dates, it liquefies, and there's these miraculous properties about its viscosity and its weight that nobody can explain. The only times that it hasn't done it on those particular dates are when the people in Oviedo had elected communists to be their mayor. All right? It did liquefy on those dates, surprisingly enough. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. But every single time, regardless of temperature, humidity, it liquefies. And guess what type of blood is in the vial? AB. Okay, and you say, well, so what? AB, again, a lot of people have AB blood. Less than 5% of Europeans or Asians have type AB blood. The probability that type AB blood would appear at random in both places, in Oviedo, in the face cloth, and in the Shroud, it's a 99.75% probability that they have the same origin based on that blood type. Okay? Interesting. There's also pollen tests that they've done on it. They found in the Shroud itself pieces of pollen. Pollen lasts for thousands of years and is, in its pristine form. It doesn't degrade. And they've taken tape and they put it on and they look at these pollen grains they get, or they look at under a microscope. There's 58 species of pollen. 75% of them are from the Middle East, a quarter from Europe. 16 species are desert plants that grow only in Palestine, in and around the Dead Sea or Jerusalem. The pollens originating in Palestine could not have been carried on the wind to southeastern Turkey, Constantinople, or Syria, from which there are other pollens found. The Shroud must have been exposed to the open air at some time of its existence in Jerusalem and in these other places I just mentioned. All right. And that's important, because it wasn't, it's in Jerusalem, but where else has it been? Because we have to talk about that. So there are 28 different types of flowers embedded in the Shroud. 20 of these flower types grow only in Jerusalem or within 8 miles of Jerusalem. Most do not grow in Europe. 27 of the 28 types bloom during March and April. When was Jesus crucified? That same time period. Okay. So how did the Shroud get to Turin? All right? And that will also help us understand this pollen business. And you got Jerusalem, you've got Constantinople, you've got Syria, Turkey. Okay. So they have the shroud. Jesus has been raised from the dead, and the burial cloths are lying there in a specific way. This cloth would have been lengthwise twice the, that very long length, whatever I said it was, 12 feet plus. 14 feet? All right, okay. And you would lay it out, and how do they bury Jesus in it? Well, this is one long piece of cloth, front and back, but it's not front and back one piece. You lay out that long piece of cloth, you lay Jesus down on this end, and you take this end, and you bring it over. Do you understand? So it's like this. He's folded into it, and you got the image here, and you got the image here. Back, front, and back. All right? And so they would have taken that and folded it. And you can tell from the creases in how it was originally folded that it was like that. They kept that fold, although there's no body in it. And then they would have folded this way, and then in fours. And you would have ended up with a piece of cloth where the head is right, it would have been just like right there. Now, think about the situation that they were in. The Jewish authorities would have been very unhappy about that piece of cloth. And being Jews, they would have reverenced the blood that was on it. They used sacred. Remember the movie The Passion of the Christ? Mary is going around and with Mary Magdalene after the scourging, and they're wiping up all that blood with white cloth. It's because the blood that's important to them. And so they would have protected the cloth, but it's also it's this thing that Jesus was in, and they want to save that. And so they would have hidden it. Now, at the same time, as the story goes, King Akbar from Edessa had asked Jesus when he was alive, before his crucifixion, to come to Edessa where he was king and heal him of leprosy. And then there's the crucifixion, death, resurrection, ascension, Pentecost, sends the Spirit. And they would have sent, as the story goes, they sent Jude Thaddeus to Edessa to show the image of the shroud to King Akbar. Jesus can't go, but here's this image with his blood. And it's also a way for them to get the image out of Jerusalem for safekeeping, because the Jewish authorities would have destroyed it. And so Jude Thaddeus, you remember the images of Jude Thaddeus? He's got the flame coming out of his head because he was there at Pentecost. But what's he holding in his hands? Remember the statues of Jude? There's a little round thing, he's holding it. What's on the round disc in his hands? It's the face of Jesus. He's holding the shroud. All right, that's what that is. Remember, I said it's folded in a certain way that all you see is the face. So what is St. Jude holding? But the face, an icon of the face, or the shroud itself, because that's what he took to Edessa to King Akbar, who had leprosy. King Akbar is healed, and they leave the image there for safekeeping. Now, King Akbar's son, in the whole area, Edessa, which is Turkey. All right, remember some of the pollen grains and flowers are from Turkey. He converts, his kingdom converts. Well, his son goes back to paganism. And so they have to, all right, what are we going to do? We have to protect the shroud. And so it is hidden in the wall above the city gate around 525 AD. It's found. And this is exactly the time, in 525, that all the images that you see of Jesus, prior to 525, they were all very Roman, youthful, no facial hair. There's an image in the Vatican grottos, the earliest image of Christ that's painted. It's in the cemetery right next to where St. Peter was buried. and it's Christ the rising sun, and he's this like Roman god on a just flaming chariot going up into the sky. And that's how people painted Jesus, this little Roman, strong man. And right after they found the image of the shroud in that niche in the city wall in Edessa, which had been hidden there because King Agbar's son had apostatized, all the images shifted to the image of a bearded Semitic figure, Christ the Pantocrator, which is interesting. So they had found it, and there's an image there that they could see, and so they began to paint that as the image of Jesus. All right? So after this cloth is discovered in the wall niche, artists began to portray Jesus according to the shroud image. Now, there's a couple who, Alan and Mary Wanger, had developed this process for identification of trying to identify if a particular person in a photograph was the person they thought that person was. And so they would take an image of this person, take a picture, and they would take a photograph of something that we think that's this person. And they would do this polarized image thing where they would take an image this way, an image this way, and then with another filter, somehow look at them overlapped. Two photographs, but you're seeing the images overlapped each other. And in a court of law, all you need are 60 points of congruence, 60 areas where they match to say that that's the same person. Well, if you say they took, let's say, Christ the Pantocrator, one of the most famous icons painted in the 6th century, or the 500s, and they did that process, and they found 188 points of congruence between the painting and the shroud. So whoever painted, let's say, that image or other icons or even coinage where an image of Jesus had been struck, they took it off the shroud. Either it was in front of them or somebody had painted it and shared it with them, but it was the same image. So going all the way back, so now we can trace it into Edessa, which is Turkey, and we have it being discovered, and we know it was there because all the imagery that was painted of Jesus after that discovery corresponds to that face. And it's, in a way that is excessive in its proof, even for, let's say, a court of law to prove that it's an absolute thing. Do you get what I'm saying? Okay. So then where does it go? How does it get to Turin in Italy? And so it was in Edessa until 944 when it was carried to Constantinople to be given to Justinian II. And then the subsequent king, Constantine VII, began to produce coinage in Constantinople based off that image that had been brought to Constantinople. And the images that were struck on the coins are 90 points, or 90 points of congruence based on that polarized image test. And then, in 1147, King Louis VII of France comes to Constantinople to venerate this image, this folded cloth with the face of Jesus. And he remained there till 1204 when the city was destroyed by the Crusaders from Western Europe. So remember the sack of Constantinople? All right, the shroud was there at that time. And we also have pollen and flowers on the shroud from Constantinople. And so it was at that time that the shroud disappeared, or the mandilion. They call it the mandilion when it's folded, and all you see is the face. Right? But that's the shroud, just folded up. Historians speculate that the Templar Knights who were there at the sack of Constantinople, they're a Christian military order that got into some trouble and were suppressed. They were founded in Jerusalem in the 1100s. And during the 13th and 14th centuries, they worshipped an image of a bearded male head. That's the historical record. After King Philip suppressed the Knights Templar And two of the Grand Masters of the Knights Templar were burned at the stake, Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay. After they were executed, the bearded male head appears on Templar paintings that were discovered in England. All right? It's discovered in England in 1951. But these paintings, commissioned by the Templars, show that image. And right after that, in 1353, the shroud appears in France, in Leroy. That is the home of Geoffrey de Charnay, one of the Grand Masters who was in Constantinople, who was executed by the King of France because he was a member of the Knights Templar. But he had this shroud, and it somehow passed into the hands of his wife, his family, his widow, and she began to show it at her castle in France. And the king, or the bishop there, said, "What are you doing? What is that? You can't do that." And he suppressed it. And so the Pope Clement VII in 1389, after he was asked, please allow us to do this, allowed the de Charnay family to begin to show the shroud again. In 1453, the shroud is bequeathed to the Savoy family in France. It's at this point that the Pope Julius II, the guy who commissioned the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, allows veneration, public veneration, and even commissions a mass to be said along with the shroud, and builds a chapel in the Savoy Castle in France. It was damaged by a fire at that time, a fire so hot that it was in the silver reliquary that the shroud was folded in, melted. And that's where you see all these marks here. You see all these unnatural geometric patterns on front and back? That's where the silver melted into the cloth. But notice, you got this huge fire and all this silver dripping onto the shroud, and it doesn't touch in any significant way the image of the body. Right? It was preserved. These were patches sewn on by a group of sisters, the Poor Clare nuns of Chambray, and they repaired the burned areas of the shroud. And those are the same things that are still there today when you go to Turin and see it. And so it passes on to Turin through St. Charles Borromeo, who brings it to Turin and places it with the abbey there. Then people start to study it and photograph it, which is what we have here. This is an 1898 photograph. And then it's eventually given by the Savoy family to the Vatican, who now has custody of the shroud and keeps it protected in Turin. So you have this long line that's traceable going all the way back to Jesus. So we know exactly how it got to where it's at, and there's verifiable proof that it is what it is. You know, this burial shroud that passed from generation to generation, from country to country, through the pollen, through the blood types, through the points of congruence on paintings, along with this image. It's pretty interesting. Now, let's talk about the image itself, if you don't mind. All right, so it's linen, and the image itself, people say it's a forgery. It's painted on. Well, it can't be, because the depth of the image, it's a two-depth image, or it's a two-depth texture of fibrils, like claws going in, weaving. It's too deep. But the image itself doesn't even go into the depth of a whole fibril. Right? There's an image, but it doesn't go in. In other words, it didn't soak. Like if you paint something on cloth, what happens? It soaks in. There's no they call it capillarity. There's no capillarity at all. Right? So it can't have been put on by a painting or by some medieval forger, because people said, well, the carbon dating, didn't that date this thing to the Middle Ages? That's what they said. But I'm going to debunk that. All right? There's no possible way that a medieval forger even could have had the technology to image this thing onto that piece of cloth the way it's on there. There's no technology that would have been available for that. And there's darker yellow where the image is darker. And there's yellowing interrupted when one fiber goes under another. All right? There's no capillarity action. There's no material in between the threads. Even the tiny fibrils in the fibers, there's no cementing or capillarity. Now, when they photographed it, how do we get this image? They took the picture, and when they look at the negative of the picture, they get it's really a positive. This is the negative, but it's showing us the positive. In other words, the actual image, which is much more faint, it's a very light, kind of brownish thing. You can barely see it until you stand far away. Then you see the image. That's the negative. The image that's on the cloth, without photographing it, what are you looking at? You're looking at a negative. How does that happen? And so when they take the picture and look at the negative, what do we look at? The positive. This is the actual image. But what showed up on the shroud is a negative image. How could a medieval forger have done something like that? Let alone somebody in the first century. All right? So it's important to know that. It's a negative. It is very superficial in the sense that there's little depth. It's so just surface. It's directionless. They used a microdensometer to measure the details contained in this photographic negative, which yields the positive, and it shows that there are no brush strokes. It's completely random. So if you looked at a microdensometer and it was something was painted, you would see the readout would have been very uniform lines, and you say, okay, that's a painting, but it just scatters, right? Which means that there's no organized means by which it was applied. All right. It came from being draped over and under a body, okay? And what they said, see, they had this thing called, back in the 1980s, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And they brought all the top scientists from around the world, including scientists from NASA, top astrophysicists, and they allowed them to examine the shroud for a couple of days, do all these tests. And the scientists said, we're going to go into this room, we're going to look at this thing, we're going to tell you exactly how it happened, and we'll be done in 5 minutes. And they got in there, and they couldn't figure it out. How did this happen? And this is by their own testimony, what they said. There's vertical path energy. They used a V8 image analyzer, which measures 3D radiant energy, and it's like radar. And what they said is, it's like a vertical path energy that came out of the body in every direction, vertically from the body. And this is quote, it's as if every pore and hair of the body contained in the shroud contained 1 million micro-miniature lasers. All right? And that's what encoded, and that's the word they use, the image. Not painted, but encoded through a burst of radiant energy. How does a medieval forger do that? It doesn't. And this is from the top scientists in the world who can't explain this. This is no energy, even now, that could possibly do that. You know Fermilab out in Batavia, the nuclear accelerator? They said maybe something like that could conjure up the energy needed to create the burst of energy necessary to encode an image like this on a piece of cloth. So we look at the blood stains, which are all these bright things here, 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 down on the feet. I think there's a lot on the back. Yeah, all these things here. On the back of the head. Okay, on the feet, down there. See all that blood, AB blood. It was a violent death, a death of lots of blood flow. It was a religious crime. He was an outcast because he was crucified outside the city. That was the law. And he was killed by non-Jews because Jews didn't do this. Okay, only the Romans did it. Okay. So far we have the inability to explain the negative image, which is the positive. We see that he was a 6-foot-tall, long-haired man who dies from crucifixion. It's anatomically correct. The bloodstains do what blood does. We know that astrophysicists can't figure out exactly how that image got on there. We've talked about the flowers that bloom only in March and April during the Passover, grow only in the Middle East, grow only within Jerusalem. There's a one plant where they found pollen up here and on the top of the head called Gundelian tuniforte or buckthorn. It's a thorn plant. It's here at the top of the head. It only grows in Jerusalem. Remember the prophecy of when Israel wanted a king, and what was the plant, or what was the thing that was the plant that was going to rule over them? They wanted all these nice things, the trees and things like that, and they ended up with what? The buckthorn, all right, that was going to rule over them. 20 or 58 types of pollen, 20 exist only in the Middle East. You got the crown of thorns. They found wood splinters back here. Okay. We explained the headpiece. When you do certain lighting with the shroud, and you turn this lighting on and certain lights off, all you see is the blood. The image disappears, so it's real blood. The blood is different on the weaves of the fibers than the image itself. So the blood and the image are two completely different things. Got the image encoded by a burst of radiant energy of massive proportions, and you've got blood, which comes from a 6-foot-tall, long-haired guy in the first century who was executed by Roman authorities. The image, it's scorched like iron, but it's not an iron because iron marks glow under ultraviolet light. These don't. There's a chemical change in those fibers where the scorching or the oxidation takes place. They call it dehydrated oxidation. And it's like 1/10 of 1/10 diameter of a human hair penetration in some places, 1/500th of an inch in other places. And there's no way that we know of that can make marks like that. And then, when they put it into a 3D image analyzer, what happens? Did anybody of you get my flock note tonight telling you to come? Did you see that picture of the face? That's an actual, that's not an artist's representation of the face. When they put this in an image, a 3D analyzer, what comes up out of it is this thing becomes three-dimensional. So it's not a two-dimensional photograph or painting, that even the photographic negative, which is a positive when analyzed three-dimensionally, yields up a three-dimensional image of the person who was buried in the shroud. So whatever that burst of radiant energy did and encoded, it's three-dimensional. So that's why I put that face on there, because it's so cool. If you got the flock now, go back and look at that face. It's three-dimensional. That thing just pops, that body just pops right out of whatever that machine is that they put this thing in. You can see it. And it just raises up right out of it. Now, let's talk about the hands. All right? You can actually see the bones. That's that radiant energy. It's almost like an X-ray. And so you've got the hands, but there's only 4 fingers. Why? Sid? When you get crucified here, you push there with a nail through the medial nerves. It pulls your thumb in. You can't move it. It's locked in. It's locked there. So and you see the blood right here with the nail mark. And this hand here, would have been up here. Where would the blood have gone? Would have drained down the arm. You see? It drained down the arm. So you got that, the nail in the hands, and an anatomically appropriate response to a nail going in the wrist. And why did they put it there? Because if you put it here, what's going to happen? It's going to tear right out. There's a bone here which will hold the nail in place. It can't rip. It just pulls on it and creates intense pain. Now, we talked about the blood stains that were coming down. Let's see, where are we? Right, there's blood stains in here. Okay? And let's see, how'd that work? Yeah? Okay. So there's blood stains that they found in here that correspond to a hole that would have been made by the same diameter of the Roman lancia, or spear. And they would, not only did they find the blood there, but they also found not water, but pericardial fluid that would have come out of the lungs. Remember that scene in The Passion of the Christ where Longinus stabs him, and all of a sudden he falls to his knees, and what comes out? This blood and watery mix, right? Just drenches him in it. An amazing baptism. And that's what it was. And he's stunned by it. And but that's the same fluid. They found that's on the shroud. That blood and water mixture is right there. And all these marks on the back especially that you can see correspond to the whip that the Romans would have used. It's leather strips with metal balls on the end. And then the dimensions and the distance in between correspond directly to, like, if I whipped something with that, that's what it would look like. All right? So we've got a Roman lancia, we've got the Roman whip, and they also found on here myrrh. They found the burial ointment of Jesus. A very rare, we heard that in the gospel today. The aromatic nard, save this for my burial. It was worth 300 days' wages. It was rare, and it's on the shroud. Huh? Now, what about this business about the medieval forgery? All right, because they said that it was painted or somehow forged in the Middle Ages because they did carbon dating on it. Carbon dating measures when something dies, it gives off neutrons. They become different isotopes. I have no idea what I'm talking about right now. So radioactive decay after it dies. And you can measure that by its half-life, right? And so what carbon dating does is try to figure out, what that is, and it can measure that, all right, we know how long this thing has been around. So they look at the fibers, and they're able to do this. Well, they said it was a medieval forgery, but what they ended up doing is taking fibers from unauthorized sites, especially when was this thing repaired? In the Middle Ages. They took fibers from the site where the sisters had sewn those patches on. But they also took them from the bottom of the shroud, where you can also see patches. And also what happens, the shroud hasn't always been in this hermetically sealed vacuum, locked up in this church. It was hung up in churches under candles with all that smoke. There were fires around it. It got wet. That water drains out. Where does the water go? With all its salts, it goes to the bottom. And all those salts concentrate. So you've got this contaminated sample from different periods of its time. You've got the silver that had melted, which created smoke and different chemicals that are now embedded in the shroud as well. So all these things contribute to a bad sample. And carbon dating itself is notoriously unreliable. For instance, they tested a living snail and said that it was 2,600 years old. A newly killed seal, carbon dating dated it at 1,300 years old. A one-year-old leaf dated 400 years old. A Viking horn was projected into the future in 2006. All right? So, and not to say that, it's all valuable, but it also is prone to error. Plus, if you give it a sample that's contaminated, one can understand why it would give us a date in the Middle Ages, but we know it can't be, because what it is absolutely impossible to have been created in the Middle Ages. But what it shows is something that happened even earlier than the Middle Ages in the first century, but corresponds to a known historical fact, and also an article of our faith, that Jesus was executed in this manner, he was buried in this manner, and a burst of radiant energy encoded an image that's unexplainable. Then, the Middle Ages, and now. It can't be done. So the carbon dating, I think we can dismiss it. But let's talk about this burst of radiant energy. Again, The Passion of the Christ is one of my favorite movies, and there's so many amazing scenes in it. But you remember the end at the resurrection, and you're in the empty tomb, and the stone begins to roll away, and the camera shifts, and you see this light. But you look at this? You look at the place where Jesus was, what do you see? You see the shroud, but what's happening? It's collapsing on itself. That's what happened. It was there and it was gone. In a burst of unexplainable, radiant energy, which encoded the image of the person who was in it, that energy was there and then it was gone. And so was the body. And the body was no longer there. How do we know that that's what happened? Because the way the blood is, if a grave robber had come and taken the shroud off, what would have happened? It would have been smeared, and it would have been cracked. And none of that applies. So what was in there wasn't removed. It vanished. Right? Otherwise, you would have ended up with a different image or different blood stains. So that radiant energy was the resurrection. Jesus was there, and then he was gone. He was dead, and then he was alive, right? It's awesome. So The cloth collapsing through a body, giving off particle radiation consisting of neutron flux, is the only thing that can explain everything that's on the shroud. The flowers, the images of the flowers that are encoded. Even when they do this through micron electroscopy, electron microscope, they look at the eyes. Guess what's on there? Coins. There's coins there. Now, how could a medieval forger do a detail where you can even see it, except through electron microscope? And what does the coin say? It's a lepton dated to the time of Caesar. Right? Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, or Augustus Caesar, and that's an amazing detail. So there's 130 different injuries. He was scourged 90 times. There's a side wound, there's head wounds, there's feet wounds, there's wrist wounds. He was scourged. He endured this over different times over a 4 to 12 hour period. It's transferred the image in a way that's never been recorded in history. It's anatomically flawless. Too wet, the blood would have run. Too dry, it would have smudged. It couldn't have been encoded by direct contact. And so in the minute of the encoding, the blast of radiant energy, the body was gone. It was not through the contact with the body. It was the energy that was there. Chest wound by a Roman lance. The pollen from the backside is the same mineral that's from the tomb that's in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. We took a parish group and I got to say Mass in the empty tomb. And it was the weirdest thing. We get there, the Franciscans run this place. And you get 20 minutes for a Mass, and you got to chant it. And some of it's in Latin. And I didn't know. I didn't care. I'll put it in front of me. I'll wing it. But it's under this dome, and you walk in the door, and you go up these steps. There's Calvary. They got this whole complex is over the Passion. So you walk in, you go up these steps, and there's where Calvary is, which is a spit that had come out of the Temple Mount, Mount Moriah. It's all connected, and then you go down, and you come around, and you go, and there's a marble box there. You go in the door, and there's an anteroom where you do the readings. It's very small, like one or two people can fit in it, and then you go into a smaller room. And there's the marble slab. And it's got this kind of glass over it, but you can put your hands underneath the glass, and my hands are like woo. Jesus' body was, but that rock is the same rock mineral that they found here in his back. And I've told the story before, but I was so. When you're in the empty tomb and you're saying Mass on the slab, and here's the door, and it's very small. You have to crawl in, and there's the anteroom where the readings are done, and then there's a regular door that goes to the out where everybody's sitting, and everybody's kind of looking in during the consecration, and then at the Lamb of God, you have to get on your knees and go, behold the Lamb of God. And then you come out and give out communion. Jesus comes out of the tomb, and I was so freaked out, I didn't stand up, I didn't crouch long, and I hit my head. This big bump, and I was almost knocked out, and I come out, and I mean, they all like, what did you see? I said, you wouldn't believe it. So it's awesome. All right. And they also said in the carbon dating that that burst of radiant energy, which encoded the shroud, certainly would throw off the results of the carbon dating. So there's this image is there as the body is transferred from one state to another. Resurrection, the resurrection. You don't get that energy out of a corpse. A sudden, powerful burst of radiant light. Looks like that image, in the Passion of the Christ. There's light, and all of a sudden the shroud's just collapsing on itself. You're looking at that beautiful face. It's so peaceful, but the body is just ravaged. It tells us who Jesus is. Behold the man. Who do you say that I am? Also, one last thing. The timing of it works as well, because you need 24 hours for observable blood clot, and you need 40 hours before decomposition starts. You have sunset on Good Friday, or on Saturday, sunset on the Sabbath, or on Friday, excuse me. This beginning of Sabbath is Friday night at sunset. That's 28 hours. And then dawn on Easter is 38 hours. So Jesus worked it out in between the time where you had to have blood flow, blood clot, but you couldn't go up to 40 because then you'd have decomposition. And it works right in there. The timing works. Got the coin on the eyes. It's great. So I'm just going to do this one last thing of all the reasons why this is not a forgery. Okay? I'm just going to read them. So just bear with me because they're interesting. To be a forgery, medieval forgery, you would have to encode the image on only the most superficial fibers of the cloth threads. You would have to transfer an image so low in contrast that it fades into the background when an observer stands within 6 feet of it. You have to create an image that is pressure independent so both the frontal and dorsal, back and front, are encoded with the same intensity, even though the dorsal side would have had full weight. You have to use an image-forming mechanism that operates uniformly, regardless of what lies beneath, over diverse substances such as skin, hair, coins, flowers, teeth, and bones. You have to encode thousands of body image fibrils with the same intensity. You have to create an image that is not composed of any particles or foreign materials of any kind, with the individual joints of its individual fibers remaining distinct and visible. You have to create an image that is not soluble in water, remains stable when subjected to high temperatures, does not demonstrate signs of matting, capillarity, saturation, or diffusion into the fibrils. You have to encode an image that lacks any evidence of two-dimensional directionality. Remember, it's a 3D image. Compose a yellowed body image out of chemically degraded cellulose with conjugated carbonyls that has resulted from processes associated with dehydration and oxidation. Encode the front and back full-length image on cloth of a real human being in rigor mortis. Incorporate specific effects of draped cloth that fell through the body region, such as blood marks displaced into the hair, motion blurs at the side of the face and the neck, throat region, and below the hair, along with elongated fingers. Encode a superficial, resolved, and three-dimensional image of the closed eye over the different invisible features of a coin. Transfer the body marks before encoding the body image, yet still place them in the appropriate location, and ensure that the blood marks are not altered when the body image is later transferred onto the cloth. You understand what I'm saying? The blood's there, and now you got to get this image, and it has to correspond directly to where the wounds are. You have to create an actual blood marks with actual serum, heart serum, around the edges of the various wounds. You have to reproduce blood marks incurred at different times with different instruments that correspond with both arterial and venous bleeding. You have to encode blood marks on the cloth in exactly the form and shape that develop from wounds on human skin. You have to embed the cloth in the cloth, the various blood marks leaving the original smooth surfaces between the skin and the blood intact. You have to remove the cloth from the body within 2 or 3 days without breaking or smearing the blood marks. You have to employ a mechanism that transfers distance information through space in vertical straight line paths. You have to produce an image that is a vague negative when observed by the naked eye, but with highly focused and finely resolved details that become visible only when photographed, at which point the negative turns into a positive. Encode accurately proportioned three-dimensional information on a two-dimensional surface that directly corresponds to the distances between the body and the cloth. Include realistic details of scourge marks so minute that they are invisible to the naked eye and can only be seen with cameras, photographic enlargers, microscopes, and ultraviolet lighting. Encode a line representing the narrow lesion of the side wound that corresponds to the shape of the lancia used by Roman executioners in such a manner that the line would not be visible with the eye and could not be seen until the development of computer imaging technology 600 years later. That's from the Middle Ages to 600 years now. Distribute an array of pollens onto the shroud beneath the linen's threads and fibers that reflected its manufacture and history in Jerusalem and Turkey. To do this successfully, the forger would have to not only be a pollen expert, but also anticipate development of the theory that emerges 600 years after the Middle Ages, which asserts that the shroud, the face cloth, and the image of the Edessa are the same. Encode the subtle appearance of Judean plants in the off-image area of the shroud that would not have been seen for more than 600 years later. Place microscopic samples of dirt and limestone at the foot of the man in the shroud that matched limestone found in Jerusalem, but would not be visible for centuries. Encode actual whole blood and watery fluid at the side wound and the small of the back in a uniquely realistic manner, and also encode this and other clotted bloodstains on the shroud so that they remain red and do not darken over time like actual blood does. Encode the appearance of Pontius Pilate lepton over the right eye of the man so that only when photography, photographic enlargers, and three-dimensional reliefs are invented 600 years after the Middle Ages, the motif, letters, and outline of the coin can be read. The forger would not only have to anticipate this technology, but also the development of the field of archaeology and the discovery in the late 20th century that coins were used in burials in Jerusalem and the surrounding area between the first century BC and the first century AD. Encode the wound on cloth at the man's left side so that when the image was photographed 500 years later, the wound would be located in the precisely correct location on the man's right side so that the blood and water would escape from the victim as if he received a post-mortem wound at this location. To encode these features, our forger would not only have to have understood advanced scientific principles, he would have had to possess knowledge of anatomy and medicine that was centuries ahead of its time. Obviously, it would have been impossible for him to have possessed such knowledge and understanding, but even if he had, somehow, he still couldn't have seen any of these numerous features to know if he was getting them right. The technology needed to see them would not have been developed for another 600 years after the Middle Ages. How could a medieval artist have displayed a knowledge of physiology that would not be known until centuries later? How could an artist paint without showing any evidence of directionality? How could an artist encode three-dimensional information on a two-dimensional surface that directly corresponds to the distance between the cloth and the body? Finally, how could a medieval artist include details that are so undetectable with the human eye and become visible only under ultraviolet light and only through a microscope and only on three-dimensional reconstructions or only on the most advanced 20th century computer scanning devices? That's pretty awesome. This is what John Paul said when he prayed in front of the shroud on May 24th, 1988. As we contemplate the shroud, the desire to seek constantly the fact of the Lord arises in believers. His mysterious face, which is revealed to the eyes of faith, his human face, which we are able to recognize in that of our brothers and sisters, especially the poorest and the neediest. This face, which we contemplate in the shroud, is eloquent in its silence and peace, and may it become the source of serenity and hope for everyone. The Lord be with you. May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thanks, everybody. Did you guys want to see the tabernacle?